going to sort of take us into the world of architectural education, which I hope is going to be an interesting read in terms of thinking about how we conceive the city. It's in quite sort of broad, conceptual and speculative terms, but I hope through looking at what I'm going to propose to the city as an archive, that we'll think about what it is to study the city and what it is to begin to propose projects which become studio projects, as in design studio projects in architectural education. And I'm going to end particularly in a project which Ophelia talked about yesterday, which was a studio we ran last semester looking at the Royal Exchange, the City Chambers in Edinburgh, as a kind of a site that we worked with. So there's three sort of steps on this journey. First of all, I'm going to do a little excursion into the world of excursions in architectural education. What does it mean to, what do architects when they're learning go and look at, what have they looked at in the past? There's been a shift, and I've positioned some work that I've been doing in relation to what field work means in architecture and architectural education. And finally, I'm going to sort of think about a world where you start to speculate. So you start to work with the city, work with the archive, and in particular situations in different cities. So the city as an archive. The Architectural Association in the 19th century was one of the first kind of groupings of architects who had consciously been trained within the sort of UK institutional framework. It was independent. It was an informal arrangement of people who gathered. And what's very interesting is they ran what they call these excursions in the 1880s particularly. And this is one strand of kind of what architects have done to learn from places. So these are various examples of places that this group of architects, or a series of groups of architects went to in these periods. There's a wonderful list of places. These are all albums from the Architectural Association archives. These fantastic sort of sepia photographs, and in the early stages of photography being used like this. Norfolk, Worcester, Kettering, looking at examples of well-built kind of Gothic churches. There's a lot of sort of market towns, kind of looking for a sort of English tradition of building. And this is where there's a concern with learning from the craft, going to look. We find that people are gathering, you can see little sketchbooks down here. There's a lot of posing, which I quite enjoy. There are people who get caught in these sort of moments of the excursions, although there seems to be very little other activity. And you know, this is a conscious learning to look, going to visit, actually going in situ to these places, to go and study, to think about the construction. The comments that come with all these observations are to do with the kinds of construction, the beauty of the detail, the sort of the joy of the particular kind of arches and vaulting. There also was a locus for various other institutions, like this is the Architectural Association of Ireland, who came to London and Oxford and were looking around. And these itineraries are very interesting because they sort of draw to attention the kind of things that seem as valuable to look at. I'm jumping on a little bit further to, I suppose this is a sort of this slide shows a history of what architects have learned from over a couple of hundred years, what we might learn from in the future. And I suppose I'm just going to roughly, on the timeline, go from left to right. This was actually done at the moment of the Oxford Conference in 2008, which marked 50 years beyond the first Oxford Conference, when architectural education became part of the sort of institutions of universities, and it became kind of configured in a certain way in the UK. So that was one of the key markers. We're thinking about 50 years ahead. The excursions I've just shown you from the AE archives don't quite fit into this. They're sort of slightly different. They sort of fit in the 19th century as a slightly parallel tradition. Prince and Lubbock talk about two traditions of the Grand Tour, which is this classical itinerary, which you're all familiar with, going to Italy, going to measure buildings, going to find the great artifacts and encounter them. And obviously this process of being away is also about building up your client base, building up your portfolio with all the networks and connections. There's a certain kind of architectural practice that develops through that. The AA excursions are very interesting and less talked about. Much more kind of English tradition of learning from the craft and the actual building of, particularly in the sort of market towns, the smaller parts of the UK. So those are two things going on. In the mid-20th century, we are very familiar in architectural discourse of think about the top two images in the middle there, Leonard from Las Vegas, Venturi, Scott Brown, and Eisenhower, when they start to shift a whole sort of draw attention to the sort of the sprawl, the kind of overlooked parts of the American city. But they also set up a model of a studio, an architectural education working with a problem, with a place. It was an urban design studio, it wasn't an architectural studio. And this has been a sort of a thread that's kind of continued to various people like Glenn Koolhaas and Learning from Lagos, the projects in the city that was done at Harvard, which have become a way of developing architectural education and thinking about learning from cities. And there's there's a sort of, we kind of operate in architectural education with all these sort of foundations. Through this, it's not accidental, I think, that the development of histories of travel are parallel to this. So we have the AA excursion, they were on bicycles, quite often they were on bicycles, slightly later in motor cars, but it actually was about the time of the trip and being very walking, cycling, very slow encounter. We know that in Venturi, Scott Brown, we were celebrating the car in the 60s, we're thinking about travel and the space of the road. The big boom in sort of low-cost airline has hugely affected the capacity for architectural students to engage with everywhere in the world very, very quickly, to be very fleeting, picking up and capturing of the experiences of places, which has again affected education. Now we've got a future that's kind of quite uncertain. These are not sort of set trajectories. So I think it's a very interesting area to think what this means as we go on. Here's just some snippets. This is from, you're familiar with the Learning from Las Vegas. This is the first edition book, which Denise Scott Brown hated, but it's actually quite graphically interesting, describing the studio. I've got this little blip in here, which I need to do this before. Sorry about that. So I think this is an emphasis on learning from what exists. This is very much about the present moment. The present moment being the experience of the moment, less about the encounter with the particular building, whether it's the Gothic church in Kettering or whether it's the artefact of the Grand Tour. And obviously they were experimenting with different modes of presentation, the deadpan world influenced by the pop artists of Ed Ruscha of the 1960s, how to document sort of time and movement in their work. And later there's been some work done recently on the bigger archive that they developed and actually scrutinising what else they collected, and also the techniques they used. These wonderful images of kind of quite low-tech sort of cameras positioned on top of the bonnets of cars, which are actually taking photographs that are presented in the books. And the famous helicopter that Venturi's have hired to get some of those sort of semi-aerial views of the strip. And I suppose this leads into a sort of world that I'm interested in, both in terms of practice and education, in terms of techniques. How we think about what we do when we encounter a place, when we work with a place that we're either learning from or going to work in as a designer. So this is from an edited book from a conference which I was involved in. And going inside the book, this is a whole series of sort of, we kind of were looking at the question of what fieldwork was in architecture, and practice, site and techniques were the three main sections that material was organised by. And what I've done here, this is basically all the images from the book. It's a classic academic graduate book with masses of text in it. It's a bit impenetrable. I was quite interested in what would happen if you took all the visual material out and actually look at it in a different way. So there's 4 chapters around this fieldwork practice, and there's 4 around fieldwork site, and this area of techniques, which traces a really interesting world of thinking about the architect who initially is working in a particular site where the marking of the ground is part of the project. A couple of architects who are thinking about their own practice of building their houses and what goes on in that process. Peruzzi St. John error, the actual building process, and the techniques of managing error. And then the last 2, which I'll show you a few more slides of in a minute, which are one to do with video and the other one to do with a more forensic archaeological approach to the site. I was interested in the idea that in all these engagements, a bit like a sketch in the Gothic porch, that we're making work, we're making sketches, there's drawings, there's photographs, there's constructions. So Rosalia Campasinu's work is looking at Bombay and also a route to Stansted, and she's trying to capture this sort of motion. I think this is very typical, a lot of work we see, a lot of the way people experience the world when they're thinking about engaging with it in a contemporary condition. So this is her tales from Mumbai. She's highlighted, she's got all this mosaic of many, many images. She's highlighting many parts of it. This is the sort of way that I suppose many people are sort of seeing and experiencing the city in its globalized sense. Now, the city, Rostalia's work represents the sort of ever-growing global city. We have the world of the declining post-industrial city, which is one of our major situation we're concerned with. And here, this is about kind of being forensic, about thinking about what it is, how do we work with this blighted landscape in their case. And this project actually takes a very forensic approach. They collect almost microscopic fragments, catalogue them, start to document, start to draw through them, looking for particular clues in different ways. And then that starts to begin to be the project of making propositions in a series of ways that the indexing of the parts has become the starting point for, and then moving to a kind of proposition. In sort of, in the introduction, I've kind of set out some of the things that we're thinking about here in terms of what is going on between the architect working in a particular place through the field and the work. In terms of moving more on to the speculation, so I suppose I'm in the broader question of what is the city as an archive. In my work here in the university, I've run for a number of years a series of studios, the Master Architect which I'm currently involved in, and also the Edinburgh Exchanges, which the City of University work is part of. So, working with a European city, and this is in Cardiff, we're really after 2 years, we brought effectively our own makings of the city back into the studio. This is the Navati Gallery upstairs. And this is one in Ross Perkins, who's one of the students, and his work from that. And I suppose when I'm showing you all this work, it might seem I've gone quite far away from World Heritage Site, is this trying to set up a possibility in the city. If it's seen as an archive, then we should be able to look from within the city to uncover potential for future design strategies. And quite clearly in education, we're thinking about what those strategies might be, what we might particularly draw on, and how we might draw from them. I'm going to spend a little bit more time sort of dwelling now on this project here. So we ran this as a sort of 11-12 week project. There were 16 students, I think. And the proposition was really to look at a key piece of Edinburgh's urban infrastructure as thinking about the city as an archive. So I chose the Royal Exchange and City Chambers because it's an incredibly interesting movement in Edinburgh's history. It's where 1754 the city decides that it needs a space to convene, to sort of have a place for the merchants to actually make trade. And it's the first move, this sort of space that's proposed by William Adams, the first move in the city to actually make a designed kind of public space, albeit with some rules for the merchants, before the new town is actually built. And so it's a really nice moment of holding a lot of medieval fabric, but with an aspiration to overwrite it with another kind of aspiration for a public space of engagement and exchange. Now we know that it failed as an exchange, something like 1810 I think it was, so 50, 60 years later, also didn't work as an exchange. City Chambers took it on as its administrative centre, so it's gone through a whole series of adaptations of use and alteration. And it's an incredibly interesting sort of piece of fabric that demonstrates this palimpsest of the city kind of inbuilt form. It's also topographically interesting in terms of Edinburgh's particularity as a site. The discrepancy between the 11 stories at the back and the 4 stories at the front, building on the extreme hill, where fronts are backs and backs are fronts, and the city has reorientated itself in different ways, is incredibly interesting. So the problem the students were working with was basically how to reconnect these levels. So they were effectively being asked to make a proposal that would work through these. But we were thinking through, trying to think quite rigorously about what it is we were looking at to draw from in the city. So what drawings, what existing buildings, what pieces of text, what information was critical for us to use to then make possible interventions. So if the city's at the archive, we're kind of effectively field working, so we're studying the city, but we're also going to make projects in the city at the same time. So, and in the same way that architecture always works between theory and practice, not always consciously, not always in a linear fashion, but we're always working between construction and speculation. I'm very interested in the idea of knowledge being cited, and what evidence there is held in the built form is dependent on how you read it, how much knowledge you have of it. There is the material around encounter, is the sort of a kind of zeitgeist that we have a privileging of the encounter often is very important. But we also have this huge sort of possible indexing through documents that document how the building came to be, how it's being used, etc., and how we sort of seek information from that. And I think for me, the shift from the project of studying something to making it a future project happens in this shift between knowledge being situated, and when you're discovering that knowledge, you're then reforming it, you're discovering it, you're reworking it in some way. So by working with a city as a collection of buildings, built fragments, and documentations, text and visual and drawing, etc., you're working over documentation, you're kind of drawing out potentials of the site. The invention of drawing over is a design act in itself. And some sort of principles that are coming through, I suppose, are a design process where learning from what exists grounds an invention of what might exist in the future. And this emphasises the kind of closeness of investigation of critical practices, speculation, techniques of material spatial thinking. In this project, and Phoebe mentioned it yesterday, for those who were here, we have these what we call freeze frames, and this came from this Literature sort of a quote which suggested this freeze framing of the life of a project. And I thought it was a very useful pedagogic device to actually almost give us a snapshot. So there might not be a physical finish, so the convention of start a project, you have a middle of the project, you finish it. In practice, you start a building, it's under construction, it's completed. What happens if we conceive the whole process of building in the city as a series of snapshots in time? So pedagogically in the studio, rather than set ourselves up as here's the brief, let's have some tutorials, let's have a final review, we had freeze frame reviews at 2-week periods throughout the studio. Roxandra and other colleagues came in and were sort of participants in that. And the students were grouped into, they were directed to look at 4 different areas. So there was a sort of rotation of what people looked at. Text in the archives, and we have to sort of blink around any other information. So you just looked at text, you just looked at the exterior of the building, or you just looked at the interior of the building. And the students did that in slightly different sequences. And through that process of looking at the situated knowledges, it accumulated moves and clues and features that developed into projects. So for instance, one of the really fantastic text researches that we found was this original contract document on the exchanges, one of the earliest detailed descriptions of setting the building contract. It's not an accident. A lot of these, this building was for lawyers, and they were very, very keen to write this up in a very detailed fashion. And that was something that became very useful because students started to look at some of the text and then actually speculate on what it meant, what it contained. Could they draw a proposal from that text? Could they draw what was suggested from that? And very, some of them did do that. These are a couple of the visual archives that we found, as in the Old College. This was not built as a wonder. It was only built in sort of 3 quarters, and the West Wing was something that didn't happen initially. So the myth that this was as intended as one great space, but the reality was it's much, much more of an accretion. And The city archives are obviously in the bottom of this building, and so one of the things we encourage students to engage with the drawings of the city and of that building in there. There's 4,000, 5,000 drawings of the building. It's not something you can do in a short studio project, but I think what was interesting was that almost overwhelming sense of the amount of documentation and a necessity to then sort of have to understand or take a view of how you might move through it. The students did measure drawings of exterior parts of the building and did study of parts of the interior of the building. This is the previous study of these ossified glazed brick surface categories. In a previous project, therefore, so somebody saw this yesterday, but just as a, what you can see is she ended up, so through the process of these freeze frames, where we kind of almost took stock at every moment, students had different preoccupations, and we started to work with that and see parts which might be generative to take further. And Ophelia's work was with this west wing, this addition that became the holder of the new council chamber when the city realised its front was actually outlooking towards Waverley Valley. And it sort of moved out that way. And these are where she repeated her particular preoccupations. And you know, the actual construction of drawings in a project are as significant as the idea, very much the idea. And I think the rigour of extracting different datum layers, the relationship between High Street and Coburn Street, pulling out these service cores. There was also discoveries to do with the slippages between walls and windows and possibilities for thinking in different ways, abstracted ways, thinking how you might rethink what this sort of evidence, what this archive of, what this is sort of working with the archives was doing. And there's a sort of re-archiving process. So Ophelia indexed effectively these pieces she was interested in this sort of city as archive. The coal shaft, the sort of goods lift, and how they'd changed the sort of area of this place. There were key elements that became sort of generative in terms of how the project developed. And her project was quite, it was kind of very simple, quite small moves. In fact, it was just working around these ossified parts to de-ossify them and to make a proposed sort of set of spaces that would be occupied by, I think it was Historic Scotland actually in the end, thinking about their future environmental agendas. But it was really just, I mean, I suppose what's interesting about this project is thinking about how you get to a possible proposition, a possible proposal in a way that's rigorous and that is working very specifically with maybe some hidden knowledges about the building, not something that is just visibly evident, but something that's critically understood. This is some of the work. This is a very quick sort of set of slides. This is some of the neighbourhood rural tourism work. They were thinking about architectural education here and this idea of the continuity of the project and actually then having to take snapshots or more critical slices through it. But we worked in the Morrison Place studios. These are some of the final work presented as part of our assessment. This was another project done by student science Raja. Bottom drawing here, which you can see, I suppose, with the critical starting point from that. So those students started from the drawing in the archive, and they found this overwhelming number of drawings, and they didn't know how to navigate it. So what they did is they found all the plan proposals, every single proposal, whether it was built or unbuilt, and they overlaid them to sort of almost sort of see this as a kind of mass landscape that people thought about adjustments in some, or alterations in some way. And from that, they found that there were areas where there were particular darknesses, lightnesses, they were thicker. And then they used that starting point for developing moves. In Cyan's case, what he was interested in the fact that when you overlaid all these plans, there were lots of discrepancies. And he became very interested in this idea of discrepancy, in a way that something that might have been planned at one time slightly shifted. And this is an opportunity where you can see what happens in that place between. And that became a way sort of set out a whole new idea of a landscape of discrepancy. And his sectional proposal reoccupies Mary King's Close, the arcade, and the entrance part of the courtyard. That's at a slightly larger scale. And he was interested, the discrepancies he read as something that called obsolete objects. So you had this idea of the obsolete passage, an obsolete clock, and maps which were kind of redundant to be housed in And that's some of his more detailed drawings. There's another student who started with the same kind of overlay of the proposal plans, and he became very interested in that darker part, which he saw as a really big critical spine. It had stayed very similar over time, and he was really interested in keeping that. And then he started studying that in many different ways, including the words at the top, which were different uses, but also spatially, just as a way of inventing from a set of drawings that were almost, they're not as existing, because none of these necessarily exist, but they are in space for ideas. And his proposal in the end worked through the spine of that section. He proposed his link between the two was a new kind of public library and private sort of special collection that reoccupied the whole of that section and made the link between Coleman Street and Royal Mile. We did various things after the studio. We made a book.
That predates Instagram.
Sorry?
The predates.
I know. And we put up drawings. We also kind of did a little mini project afterwards to think about, there was a lot of preoccupation about the arcades in the street, and we were very interested about what would happen if we actually took something back into the city itself and it became another layer, very temporarily. So we made some plinths. You get plaques in the city. These are 2 plinths that were here for 2 weeks last summer. They're just plywood. They've got some of the content of what we had worked on, the original contracts, some of the drawings and proposals. We're kind of interested in playing between the plaques, which tell you things about the city, which tell you about the history, and other things that might have been drawn out that might be other histories. This was this Cyan student I mentioned earlier who sort of pulled out to start thinking about discrepancy in terms of the city scale. And I suppose there's a sort of question about, as architects, we often think about the scope of the building project. Quite clearly, it's got much bigger ramifications. The discrepancies between plans, the red lines actually a Victorian kind of moves through a sort of medieval frame. That's my final slide. So, in conclusion, I suppose I'm just really wanting to think about and offer a kind of a thought that if we think about the city as an archive, rather than say a laboratory, as it's often thought about in architectural education, it's a place we test ideas. Sometimes the city is thought about as a work of art, so it's something that's finished and complete and has an artifact quality to it. If we think about it as an archive in some way, how do we, say as designers or architects or people managing the city, work as archivists? What is it to critically work in the city? Do you take that on board? For me, I think that opens up a whole lot of opportunities to think and work critically and with some precision, and not necessarily working within kind of scientific paradigms or artistic paradigms, but actually thinking in terms of the built and constructed reality.